Amen.
All right, guys. Well, my name is Bryan Hollon, and I am the city director for the C.S. Lewis Institute of Northeast Ohio. If you don't know anything about the C.S. Lewis Institute, we are headquartered in Washington, D.C., but now have branches around the country and a couple of branches over in the United Kingdom. I have not been the city director very long. Before me was Dan Osborne. Beth Ann has been on for longer than I have been, although I have been the resident theologian with the Institute for about 4 years and thoroughly enjoy working with the C.S. Lewis Institute. My full-time job is professor. I'm a professor of theology at Malone University in Canton. I'm also a church planter and an Anglican priest. I know that you guys probably have a lot of Anglican priest friends, and so I'm just one of many for you. Thank you to those of you who are smiling. But I'm actually up in my office at church right now at St. John's Anglican Church in Canton, Ohio. So I do that. I specialize theologically in a discipline or a field called ressourcement theology, which is an effort to sort of equip or resource the church in the church's classic sort of ancient wisdom. And so it's very much in keeping with C.S. Lewis's project. He was a classicist. He was steeped in sort of the great tradition. And his phrase, mere Christianity, is actually meant to communicate the fact that there is a kind of consensus tradition coming down through the ages, and that we are all unified if we are Orthodox Christians in that tradition. And so just about everything I do is sort of in this area of mere Christianity. And so that's enough. That's all I will say about myself tonight, except for that my wife, Suzanne, is also on over here. She's the one with the same last name that I have. I have 3 kids. My mother is here also. She's also got the same last name. She's with us from South Texas. So I will leave it at that and introduce to you guys Beth Ann Valentine.
Hello, everybody. Welcome. It's good to see some new faces that I haven't met before, and we're glad to have you with us. And we're also glad to have all of our former fellows, alumni, board members, and some of our mentors and pastors that we know from the area. So welcome. It's going to be a good night. I want to tell you a little bit about me. I've been with the C.S. Lewis Institute for 7 years. It's been amazing to work with Bruce Beard, Dan Osborne, and now my new boss, Bryan Hollon. One of the things I want to tell you a little bit about is the Fellows Program. We are going to be looking at introducing a next application period starting January 4th. And so if you know anybody that's interested in the program, it is a year-long intensive and intentional fellows program where we couple the mentoring with the accountability. We have small groups, we have lectures, we have some classic reading, and it is intense, but it's so worth it. Anything that is worth anything is intense, I think. So if you're interested, you can contact us, or you can go to our new website, which is cslewis-neoh, or neo.org. And if you're looking for information about it, you can call me, and we can talk about it. Also, the vision for the C.S. Lewis Institute is to equip churches and equip our fellows to be disciple makers. So if that's something that interests you, then please come and talk to us or give us a call. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Beth Ann. I am going to go ahead and share my screen now. And I will begin with a kind of introduction of this particular book, The Abolition of Man, and say a few words about that before I get into a kind of it's really a guided reading is what I'm calling tonight. I know that some of you guys are probably using Kindle. Some of you may have listened to the book on audio book. Some of you may have the same text that I have. Whenever I reference the text tonight, I will use pages from one of the more recent publications. And it's very likely that if you've got a hard copy, you've got the same pagination. But if you do not have the same pagination, I'm going to be actually reading on the screen fairly large chunks of text. So I think we can all sort of follow along. My goal is simply to help help the text sort of pop out to you so that you understand it more deeply. You sort of put it in context. Some of you may be able to do that already, but hopefully as a result of tonight, it'll become even richer for you. And so I'm going to scoot you guys over just a little bit so that I can see my whole screen. Can everyone see my screen at this point? Beth Ann, you can see it? Okay. So let me go ahead and jump in. This is the Abolition of Man. In late February of 1943, C.S. Lewis traveled with his brother, Warnie, from Oxford to Durham, where he was scheduled to deliver the Riddle Memorial Lectures. His 3 talks were soon published in a little book, which was titled, and is titled, The Abolition of Man. Some of you guys may know that Lewis published a number of his books through lecture series or radio broadcasts. That would have included, for instance, Mere Christianity, The Four Loves, also his series of sermons, The Weight of Glory, and others. And so this was a kind of common thing that he did. He was asked to speak in various places, and when he finished his series, those series would be published. And he became, of course, an extremely popular lecturer during the wartime, above all else. And so the Abolition of Man is now widely considered Lewis's most important nonfiction work. It is number 7 on National Review's top 100 nonfiction works of the 20th century, which is a pretty big deal. There have been some great theological and philosophical works written in the 20th century. It is number 2 on ISI's top 100 list. And I don't know how many of you are familiar with ISI, the Intercollegiate Studies Institute. This is a kind of conservative think tank, especially focused on introducing college students to the deepest and the richest sort of traditions of conservative thinking. They highly prize the Abolition of Man, and I think rightly. Lewis's friend and fellow Inkling, Owen Barfield, remarked that there may be a piece of contemporary writing in which precision of thought, liveliness of expression, and depth of meaning unite with the same felicity, but I have not come across it. Now, Barfield, if you don't know, was a fellow Inkling with C.S. Lewis, and he was probably Lewis's best friend. Lewis had a deep affection for Barfield, and so it might seem like a kind of a natural thing for someone like Barfield to offer such a compliment, but it actually is unusual. The Inklings were highly critical of each other in the best sort of way, and we shouldn't take this praise lightly. I think that Lewis was probably tremendously flattered. More praise. The great Boston college philosopher Peter Kreeft lists The Abolition of Man among 6 books to read to save Western civilization. Now, that is a big claim, and I hope that I can do just a little bit tonight to help you see how, in fact, The Abolition of Man, properly understood, really does, at the very least, give us some deep insight into what is actually wrong with Western civilization. I'm not so sure that it will help us to save civilization, but at least we can know a little bit more about what's going wrong. Elsewhere, Kreeft writes, I believe the 2 most prophetic books of our century, and he wrote this in the late 20th century, are Aldous Huxley's Brave New World and C.S. Lewis's Abolition of Man. Lewis has one great advantage over Huxley, and that is he is a Christian. Lewis called it the favorite among my books, but in general, he said, it has been almost totally ignored by the public. Now, that was true of Lewis's time. And all the praise that I've just mentioned, besides that of Barfield, is much more recent praise. And so what's happened is that people have returned again and again to The Abolition of Man and seen just how prophetic it was. And so it is actually a book that is growing in stature as the years pass, and as Lewis's predictions and prophecies, if you will allow me to use those phrases, really do sort of bear out. Walter Hooper was probably the most important Lewis scholar of the late 20th, early 20th century, and he wrote that it is an all but indispensable introduction to the entire corpus of Lewis's writings. And it really is true that this particular book really gets to the heart, especially of Lewis's sort of philosophical insights but also of his moral insights. We see issues and themes addressed in, for instance, Mere Christianity, really sort of come into a fullness here in The Abolition of Man. We also see in Lewis's fiction work that hideous strength, the kind of human being that he is describing in The Abolition of Man, sort of put in fiction in The Hideous Strength. And there are all kinds of themes here in The Abolition of Man that play out in his other works, really throughout his entire corpus. So we should ask ourselves, why is this book so widely praised? And I think the answer might be that the work truly is prophetic. Lewis saw what was to come with the West's denial of objective standards of right and wrong. Now, we all know that there's something wrong with what we might call subjectivism or with moral relativism. But Lewis saw these problems in a way that was especially acute. And he saw these problems sort of playing out in greater depth than I think even today many of us are aware of, because we live in a world that is so thoroughly awash in relativism. And so I think he can help us see more deeply just how troubling the moral relativism, which is all around us, really is for our lives. The Abolition of Man offers a compelling defense of these moral standards that are missing today, as well as a stern warning about the consequences of denying them. Moreover, we see many of his predicted consequences unfolding in our own time. And so I want to now say just a few words about Lewis's sort of context in the 20th century. It helps to understand why these issues were such a concern to him. You know, he wrote in the mid 20th century, probably his greatest and most prolific decades were the 40s and the 50s. And these were times of intense trouble. Lewis himself fought in World War I, what is called the Great War, where more than 20 million people, not only soldiers, but also citizens, were killed. Now, the Great War was a shock to Europe because it came at a time when the Industrial Revolution was really beginning to sort of pay dividends. Technological progress was just beginning to reach the kind of speed that we all know every day. But to people in the early 20th century, the technological progress taking off around them was shocking. And so in the early 20th century, and at the turn of the century from the 19th to the 20th, there was incredible optimism in Europe. People really did think that the world was going to get better and better and better. And suddenly, the most sophisticated, the most civilized people on earth, Europeans, lined up and fought in trench warfare, in places like Verdun, France, and just mowed each other down, and millions and millions and millions of people died. And this created for Europe a kind of intellectual crisis. And many of the greatest theologians and philosophers and general sort of intellectuals in the humanities actually came out of the First World War and lived through the Second World War. That was true of Lewis. It was true of Karl Barth. It was true actually of a whole sort of generation of French and German and English theologians. This was an extremely prolific age because the time was so intense that the theology and the philosophy that they were writing was so obviously important. It just mattered. He also, of course, lived through World War II, where an estimated 60 million people were killed. He lived through the Holocaust. He saw what humankind was capable of, and it wasn't good, and it's not good. He saw the rise of scientism, of secularism, of communism, and of fascism, each representing a clear rejection of the kind of ancient wisdom that had been Lewis's own education, and which he had loved from the time that he was a little boy. And all of these new isms were sort of wrapped up in an almost utopian confidence in the future. And that confidence, only a couple of generations after the First World War sort of captured Europe once again. The 20th century was a time of tremendous struggle. And so Lewis lived through what is indisputably the most violent century in human history. And if you've never heard this before, you might take note that more people were killed by violent means in the 20th century than in all previous centuries combined. And most of that bloodshed occurred between the First World War, and really the end of the 1960s. It was the communist revolutions, it was fascism and Nazism primarily that were responsible for all of the bloodshed. And it's important to note that none of those movements were even remotely Christian in their foundations. They were utopian schemes, generally, whether it would be Hitler's dream of an Aryan race that would be kind of the, what Nietzsche called the Übermensch, or the communist ideal of tearing everything down to finally build a just society. People were rejecting the past in order to what they believed was build finally a great world. And so Lewis was concerned, obviously, that rapid technological advance was taking place just as the West was rejecting the traditional restraints, the objective morality necessary to actually keep civilization from destroying itself. So in the mid-20th century, you could already see people all over the world using these new technologies to destroy each other, and they were. And for the very first time in the 20th century, we have the hydrogen bomb. And as we are developing the kind of technologies that are represented with the hydrogen bomb, we are rejecting the moral standards which might actually restrain us from using such a weapon. And so it's a little scary, actually, to think that we live in a world with such incredible technology and yet no moral compass to guide us really at all. So here's a summary of the abolition of man very quickly. The abolition of man is what we can expect when a civilization rejects the objective reality of right and wrong affirmed by all great peoples of the past. All great civilizations have believed in what we might call a natural law. In this book, Lewis calls it the Tao, which is what the Chinese call it, and it's just sort of an incidental name he chooses. But all people have believed in a natural law, and they have believed that society needed to be ordered by that law, even if they had different understandings of what the ultimate purpose or end of humankind is. And so the abolition of man, again, is what we can expect when a civilization rejects this natural law. And the abolition of man progresses with, first of all, what I'm trying to say is that man will abolish oneself in this order, according to Lewis. Man declares his emancipation from the Tao, from this natural law. It is no longer something real. It's no longer something we need to pay attention to. Then comes the reduction of the Tao to a mere natural product. We become what the book of Judges calls, we do what's right in our own eyes. We become a law unto ourselves. Being supposedly freed from the Tao, certain men will gain the power to subject all other men to their own irrational impulses. And so we see the rise of very, very powerful tyrants. And number 5, obedience to these irrational impulses or chance. And finally, and as a result, nature's conquest of man. And so the outcome of this progression for Lewis is that what we once called men, and I'm using Lewis's language here. Okay, please understand. No sexism is intended. It's just an easier word to say than humans or persons every time. But what we once called men have been reduced to beasts, motivated by animal instinct, the very basest of desires for maybe food and for pleasure, and also the will to survive. And so there's a kind of winner-take-all competition which rules when there is not a natural law to rule over us. Ironically, and this comes out at the end of our chapter for today, these men without chests, and I'll explain what that means later, will continue to expect and even demand virtue of each other. And so in such a world where there is no law to govern, people cry out against injustice constantly, even as they reject the very idea of justice. And I think we can identify and observe that happens in our own world. So very quickly, tonight we're going to talk about chapter 1, Men Without Chests. Next time we get together on December 3rd, we'll talk about chapter 2, which is titled The Way. And then on January 7th, we will get together one more time to talk about the abolition of man, the final chapter. Tonight, I've really got 4 primary themes I want to talk about. First of all, I want to talk about what is called the fact-value distinction. This is the problem of Gaius and Titius that it seems so strange and Lewis gets so worked up about. After talking about the fact-value distinction, I'll talk about the classical synthesis that he prefers, that he is steeped in and causes him to reject the fact-value distinction. Then we'll talk about the Tao and its implications for education, and then finally what he means by men without chests. And so let's just go ahead and get to it. And I'll try to move through this relatively quickly, but not so quickly that I'm skipping over things. And so again, I'll read from pretty large chunks of text. These first two paragraphs are from pages 1 and pages 2. And so this first one is on page 1. Lewis starts out saying, I have chosen as the starting point for these lectures a little book on English intended for boys and girls in the upper forms of schools. If you don't know what that means, the upper forms of schools are just high school. And so you can actually see over here on the right, this green book called The Control of Language by poor Alec King and Martin Ketley. These guys have been forever sort of scandalized because they are actually the authors of the book that Lewis has in mind. It was green. So he simply calls it the Green Book, and he calls them Gaius and Titius. And so in their second chapter, and this is from page 2 of the Abolition, Gaius and Titius quote the well-known story of Coleridge at the waterfall. At least in Lewis's day, this story was well known because people still, in the upper forms of school and at college, were studying a relatively classical curriculum. Most of us wouldn't know what Coleridge at the waterfall represents today. He goes on, you remember that there were two tourists present, that one called it sublime and the other pretty, and that Coleridge mentally endorsed the first judgment and rejected the second with disgust. Gaius and Titius comment as follows. They say, when the man said this is sublime, he appeared to be making a remark about the waterfall. Actually, he was not making a remark about the waterfall, but a remark about his own feelings. This confusion is continually present in language as we use it. We appear to be saying something very important about something, and actually, we are only saying something about our own feelings. So, the question we should ask is, what, in the mind of C.S. Lewis, have Gaius and Titius done wrong? And why is he so concerned? What's there to be all worked up about? Well, here's the issue that Lewis does not state explicitly. Gaius and Titius have endorsed what philosophers call the fact-value distinction. Now, this gentleman lounging over here on the right is David Hume. And in 1748, he wrote a book which is called An Inquiry Concerning Human Understanding. He was a philosopher. He was the leader of what is called, he was a Scottish philosopher who was an empiricist. Maybe not an atheist, but certainly not a classical Christian. He rejected moral standards and universals. And so David Hume is famous for a number of things, and one of those things is for articulating what we might call the fact-value distinction. And so this fact-value distinction claims that you cannot get an ought from an is, since we can differentiate statements of fact, which can be based upon natural or empirical observation, and statements of value, which encompass ethics or aesthetics. From this perspective, from within the perspective of this fact-value distinction, questions of objective moral goodness and beauty are relegated to the realm of subjectivity. We may only use the word truth, and really we may only use the word knowledge in relation to those matters of fact which can be proven by empirical methods of observation. And so this is what we might call a classically Enlightenment kind of philosophy. The Enlightenment, where someone like Kant says, dare to know, stresses human rationality and the ability of human beings to know and master intellectually all things. Hume is very much a part of the spirit of the age and believed that if in fact we could not master intellectually something, if we could not prove something through empirical observation, then it shouldn't be bothered with, that it wasn't in fact real. People at this time believed that ultimately humankind would completely comprehend all the laws of nature. In fact, just as interestingly enough, a French philosopher named Diderot was the first person to ever create an encyclopedia. He created what was called the encyclopedia movement, which was actually intended to create a catalog of all human knowledge. And in the 18th century, it was actually pretty widely believed that there would come a time when we could have these, catalogs, and these encyclopedic catalogs on our bookshelves, and virtually everything that humans could ever want to know about the world of nature, and even about our own selves. Not only anatomically but socially, could be mastered and known and sort of referred to. This was a time of incredible optimism in the abilities of human reason. And it obviously had its faults. Lewis was not a fan of the excesses of the Enlightenment. Now, consider the following logic. If you're having if it has not hit home to you what this fact value distinction means. Imagine a mother who cannot survive without a transfusion of her son's red blood. This is the fact. The mother needs a transfusion to survive. Most people would agree that it is only right for the son to help his dying mother. That's the ought. Giving blood involves no risk whatsoever, and again, a fact. And so therefore, the son ought to donate blood to his mother. That again is an ought. Now, if we accept this fact value distinction, then the argument above is simply deficient, since we cannot claim that the son ought to help his mother. The ought is merely a subjective value judgment. It is beyond the capacities of reason or logical argumentation. And so any sense of obligation or duty exists only in the mind of the son. Remember, like Gaius and Titius, whom Hume would say, there is no actual obligation. There is only the feeling of obligation. But that feeling of obligation is entirely subjective and does not correspond to any kind of reality outside of the person who possesses that particular feeling. And so there is no universal principle governing the relationship between a mother and son, which determines the goodness or the badness of his response. And so it would be fun to talk about this, but I will move on. So what Lewis does in the first, really through page 13, is he critiques Gaius and Titius's use of this fact value distinction. And so I want to highlight 4 of his critiques very quickly. Now, the first one you probably all remember because it's just kind of silly. And it is, in fact, kind of a smackdown. This is like Lewis's insult of Gaius and Titius. He points out, actually, that these people claim to be writing a grammar book, and they don't even know how to use the English language because they're using it incorrectly in their critique of classical reasoning. And so he writes this on page 3. If this is sublime, is to be reduced at all to a statement about the speaker's feelings, the proper translation would be, I have humble feelings. If the view held by Gaius and Titius were consistently applied, it would lead to obvious absurdities. And so, again, this is somewhat tangential to Lewis's overall argument. He's just pointing out that these guys are really not that bright. And he goes on then to really demolish them in the rest of the book. And so here's critique number 2. He says, the schoolboy who reads this passage in the Green Book will believe 2 propositions. The first he's really already stated. Firstly, that all sentences containing a predicate of value are statements about the emotional state of the speaker. And secondly, that all such statements are unimportant. And so he goes on in pages 8 and 9, a few pages later, to say, what he will learn quickly enough, and perhaps indelibly, is the belief that all emotions aroused by local association are in themselves contrary to reason and contemptible. And so I have a little parenthesis here where I ask us to consider this, okay? Should we love our families? That's the kind of local association that Lewis is talking about. Should we love our homes? Should we love our neighborhoods, our cities? Should we love our countries? And should we love our pets? then we should ask, is there a right way to love them and a wrong way? And should people be trained to love them in the right way? So whether and how we are to love our home, cities, countries is of no interest to a child's upbringing, according to Gaius and Titius, okay? Um, Education has nothing to do with helping a child know how to relate to the world around him, how to sort of train and order his affections properly. But it's these things, and this is what Lewis is really getting at. These are the most important things. This is the difference between happiness and misery. This is the difference between genuine success in life and a miserable life. How do we love our families? You know, how do we love our cities? In what way do we love our countries? You know, obviously, it can go either way. We can love in a variety of ways. I'm going to continue to talk about this in a moment. These are the things that occupy a child's whole universe. And Gaius and Titius are saying the education of that child has nothing whatsoever to do with these things. And so he goes on. Gaius and Titius, while teaching him nothing about letters, and there's another just insult, have cut out his soul. In other words, they have no interest in it. They pay no attention to it. Long before he is old enough to choose the possibility of having certain experiences which thinkers of more authority than they have held to be generous, fruitful, and humane. In other words, almost every great thinker through the ages has said these things are very important, and the way that a child relates to these things matters greatly. And so above all else, an education should pay attention to these things, okay? So an education is very much about relations. So here's critique number 3, and it really follows from critique number 2, and it's kind of related to it. We might say that though the schoolboy has been taught that feelings are unimportant, he will still have feelings. There's no question. However, he will have missed an opportunity to have those feelings properly trained and ordered. On page 11, Lewis is following this logic when he says, some pleasure in their own ponies and dogs they will have lost. Some incentive to cruelty or neglect they will have received, as they are in fact trained to love, but trained to love wrongly. And so to make this more concrete, imagine the young child, or imagine the pubescent teen in our own country who is trying to relate to the opposite sex in a really complicated world. And there are tremendous and profound ways that young man might be trained to relate to the opposite sex in noble ways, okay, in chivalrous ways, in ways that can be called good, okay, not only good for himself but good for her. His love needs to be properly ordered, and it is the point of an education classically to order those loves properly. Imagine, and of course, I think you guys can see that you know, this is not a new problem, but the problem is especially obvious today. We've got a problem with the way that we relate to each other sexually. Think about sports and the role that they play in an education. What is the right role for sports? We, of course, should love physical activity. We should love games and play and competition. But how should we love them? In what order should we love them? What is their priority in the context of education? I hope I don't need to tell you guys that we live in a world where sports are completely out of control. My oldest son actually served as a referee in high school. He was a cross-country runner, and so in the off-season, he would referee basketball games. And he complained to us about something that is evidently a growing problem and has become almost a crisis. And that is that parents are so vicious to referees that they cannot find referees anymore because parents have come to invest so much meaning in the athletic sort of games that their elementary age children are involved in, that the whole culture of it has just become vicious. We know, of course, that we can become extraordinarily disordered with the amount of attention the amount of importance that we invest in winning and in competition. Some of you guys may remember, I'm from Texas, so I remember it very well. It's probably been 25 years ago now, where a mother in Texas hired a hitman to murder the girl who won a cheerleading spot on the team ahead of her own child. Fortunately, the murder never took place. Okay, this is representative of profoundly disordered love for something that should be good, which is a kind of simple competition. We see what sports has become professionally. We see what it has become in college. When people want to talk about the role of sports, we have to almost demand that people pay attention to us, and nobody bothers because there's no space for that. In a classical world, sports would have been one of a plethora of things that were just naturally discussed in the context of an education, wherein children understood that they needed to learn how to properly order their affections and allegiances and involvements. One more, which I hope I'm making this more concrete, would be our country. We should love our country. If in fact we're not trained to love our country rightly, then we may love our country wrongly. We may actually hate our country. We may buy into those arguments and the voices today which are telling us which our country was founded in shame and that it is just sort of has nothing but a history of injustice, which would itself be a sort of disordered memory of our past. Or we may love our country so much that we are involved in a kind of vicious nationalism, which cannot be kind to an immigrant. We may become rabid nationalists, violent nationalists. We need to be taught what it means to be properly patriotic. And by the way, G.K. Chesterton wrote a whole lot about this. There are good nationalisms and there are bad nationalisms. We should be trained to know one from the other. So there's much more to say about this. And by the way, Lewis wrote a book called The Four Loves. And he actually has a section in that book also on what it means to love our country rightly. And he offers examples of what it means to love it wrongly. And that in our own time is very well worth paying attention to. So the issue again, though, is that we're going to love the opposite sex. We're going to love sport and game. We're going to love our country and our town. We're going to love. And of course, we should put some thinking into what it means to love rightly. What standards would teach us how to love rightly and to be a human being who knows how to have a flourishing life? Here's critique number 4. Gaius and Titius are not making, he says, a literary argument at all. They're making a bad philosophical argument. On page 12, he writes, I must for the moment content myself with pointing out that it is a philosophical and not a literary position. In filling their book with it, they have been unjust to the parent or headmaster who buys it and who has got the work of amateur philosophers where he expected the work of professional grammarians. And he goes on page 13. They see the world around them swayed by emotion and propaganda. They have learned from tradition that youth is sentimental, and they conclude that the best thing they can do is to fortify the minds of young people against emotion. My own experience as a teacher tells an opposite tale. For every one pupil who needs to be guarded from a weak excess of sensibility, there are 3 who need to be awakened from the slumber of cold vulgarity. The task of the modern educator is not to cut down jungles, but to irrigate deserts. And so what he's saying there is that it's kind of like in I don't remember where this comes from, but you guys may remember when Lewis talks about the fact that we human beings are like children contenting ourselves making mud pies when what God offers us is a holiday at sea. The problem is not that we need to be told, to stop making mud pies, to stop pretending. The problem is that we don't have a rich enough imagination to comprehend what it is that God is actually offering us. And so our imaginations need to be trained and stimulated with images of beauty and of goodness, of valor and honor and courage and everything else. And so the job of an educator, again, is not to just say no, no, no to what seems to be disordered, but to offer examples of order. And that is the greatest, perhaps, task of education in Lewis's mind. So when we move from page 13 to page 14, there's an important transition that takes place. Lewis really sort of leaves behind his simple critique of Gaius and Titius, and he moves on to a description of what I would call the classical synthesis, which is the worldview that he embraces, and which most humans throughout history have embraced. And so I'm gonna just move on through this and tell you that it's fairly thick stuff, but I think it'll be not so hard to understand. So notice that the fact-value distinction isolates a person. The fact of his existence, the observable is not accompanied by any obligation, the indemonstrable ought, to his environment. A person in the Enlightenment view is detached, autonomous, unburdened by necessity, by ordered relations. The proper education of such a person is concerned only with helping him or her to acquire knowledge of observable facts. Now, this is to be differentiated from the classical view and the classical understanding of education. So the classical view, which Lewis embraces, is quite different. According to the classical view, a human person is a small part of a much larger, ordered web of relations, so that a proper understanding of a person necessarily conceives him in relation to all else that exists. The image on the right, by the way, which I won't go into in great detail, is the cosmos according to Dante's Divine Comedy. People believed that everything in the cosmos had its proper end or proper purpose and was moving in a particular direction. And ultimately, everything was related to God and was ultimately meant to glorify God in some way. And so everything had its place, and everything could be determined to be either moving in the right or the wrong direction based upon sort of where it stood in the overall order of things in the cosmos. Now, even if we don't necessarily embrace the scientific understanding of that cosmos, there is absolutely no reason why we shouldn't believe. In fact, we should believe, because it's entirely biblical, that everything is actually ordered to God, and that everything declares the glory of God, as the psalmist tells us. So, moving on. The ancient view of the world is that it is a cosmos. And a cosmos is not simply everything that it is. It is an ordered whole. The difference, perhaps, between a cosmos and a universe is that while a universe is everything, a cosmos is also everything, but there is an order to it. There's a divine mind which has put everything in its place and pointed everything in a particular direction. And so there is something normative to the order of the world. In the ancient Greek view, of course, the divine was included in the cosmos. The divine human and physical were all an ordered part of this world, and all had different parts to play. Here, the cosmos, in the Greek perspective, is a very reasonable, intelligent reality. And so Lewis talks about the fact that Aristotle and Plato, and he goes on to offer examples from Chinese philosophy and from Hindu religion. Here's what he has to say about Greek philosophy. He says, Aristotle says that the aim of education is to make the pupil like and dislike what he ought. That is actually the purpose of education. When the age for reflective thought comes, the pupil, who has been thus trained in ordinate affections or just sentiments, will easily find the first principles in ethics. But to the corrupt man, there will never be visible at all. They will never be visible at all. And he can make no progress in that science. Plato before him had said the same. The little human animal will not at first have the right responses. Like a child, his loves will be so easily swayed that he'll love wrongly and will have to be disciplined and molded and trained. It must be trained to feel pleasure, liking, disgust, and hatred at those things which really are likable, disgusting, and hateful. In the Republic, the well-nurtured youth is one with a just distaste, would blame and hate the ugly, even from his earliest years, and would give delighted praise to beauty, receiving it into his soul and being nourished by it, so that he becomes a man of gentle heart. Now, In classical Christian perspective, of course, God is not a part of the cosmos. God is not a highest, distant, especially awesome part of the cosmos. Therefore, he can be immediately present to everything in a different and more intimate way. And so, what I would like to state clearly is that even though the Greek and Roman understanding of education is very similar to the classical Christian understanding of education, we're not saying that the Christian understanding of God and his relation to the world is the same as the Greek and Roman understanding of the human and his relation to the world. The Christian understanding of the universe, like the Greek and Roman understanding, is that it is absolutely ordered, but God is far more intimate, immanent in the world than the Greeks or the Romans or any other religion has ever held. And so I have a quote here from Mere Christianity, which I think articulates this really well, sort of what the Christian understanding of God's relation specifically to the Christian is. And so let me read this very quickly. Lewis writes this about prayer. He says, "You may ask, if we cannot imagine a three-personal being, what is the good of talking about him? Well, there isn't any good talking about him. The thing that matters is being actually drawn into that three-personal life, and that may begin anytime, tonight if you like. What I mean is this: an ordinary, simple Christian kneels down to say his prayers. He's trying to get into touch with God, but if a Christian, he knows that what is prompting him to pray is also God, so to speak, inside him. He also knows that all his real knowledge of God comes through Christ, the man who was God. That Christ is standing beside him, helping him to pray, praying with him, for him. You see what is happening. God is the thing to which he is praying, the goal he is trying to reach. In other words, this man is intimately ordered to glorify God the Father. The Holy Spirit is prompting him and empowering him to move towards God, and Jesus Christ is the road and the bridge that facilitates that movement. But it is a clearly ordered world, and there is a good and there's a standard. So God is the thing to which he is praying, the goal he's trying to reach. God is also the thing inside him which is pushing him on, the motive power. God is also the road or the bridge along which he is being pushed to that goal. So that the whole threefold life of the three personal being is actually going on in that ordinary little bedroom where an ordinary Christian is saying his prayers. Now, Lewis believes, of course, like Paul, that God is the one in whom we live and breathe and have our being. Lewis believed also that Jesus is, as Paul writes in Colossians, the image of the invisible God, and that he is before all things, and in him all things hold together, for in him all the fullness of God was pleased to dwell, and through him to reconcile to himself all things, whether on heaven or whether on earth or in heaven, making peace by the blood of the cross. Our Christian ancestors insisted that the ultimate end or goal of the human life is therefore to become properly situated or ordered in Christ, who is the source, substance, and end of all that is. And so the way that a Christian understanding of education would differ from that of the Greeks or the Romans is that all of our understanding of virtue and goodness, our understanding of the moral natural law is to be equated with Jesus Christ, who is the Word through whom all things were made. In other words, Jesus gives a far more definite, he gives the ultimate revelation of what that natural law consists. So for this reason, Lewis insists on page 14 and 15 that until quite modern times, all teachers and even all men believed that the universe to be such that certain emotional reactions on our part could be either congruous or incongruous to it. Believed, in fact, that objects did not merely receive but could merit or merit our approval or disapproval, our reverence or our contempt. And so the reason why Coleridge agreed with the tourist who called the cataract sublime and disagreed with the one who called it pretty was, of course, that he believed inanimate nature to be such that certain responses could be more just or ordinate or appropriate to it than others. There's a wonderful, if you've ever read Life Together by Bonhoeffer, and I need to move on, but towards the end of the book Life Together, Bonhoeffer recommends praying for our enemies. And he says that if you have an enemy and you pray for him, that enemy will be transformed from an enemy into one for whom Jesus Christ died. And so what Bonhoeffer is describing is really the reality that an education is supposed to lead to the condition that a good education should lead us to, and that is to be properly ordered to our enemies, is to see them as ones for whom Jesus Christ died, which means we have to love them and have compassion on them, and that is to see them truly. Or as Henri de Lubac, one of my favorite theologians, wrote, a person is a Christian to the very extent that he lives in a sacred atmosphere. To be properly ordered to reality in Christ will be to see everything in relation ultimately to Christ. It will be to live in a world where the glory of God which shines through all things. Thus, Lewis tells us, the Christian Traherne could ask, can you be righteous unless you be just in rendering to things their due esteem? So in fact, if you don't look upon your enemy as one for whom Jesus Christ died and therefore love him, then you can't be righteous because you're not properly ordered to your enemy. Augustine of Hippo, this is St. Augustine, defines virtue as order amoris, the ordinate condition of the affections in which every object is accorded that kind of degree of love which is appropriate to it. For Augustine, the life of sanctification or becoming holy is a life wherein we increasingly learn to love as God loves. And so when we can come to a point in our lives where we don't even have to struggle, but where we can actually truly desire the good of others, then we're a holy person. Okay? Holiness is not defined by the things we avoid or don't do, although those things are not unimportant. But holiness truly is defined by our ability to desire and pursue the good of other human beings, which is what it means ultimately to love. And of course, Jesus Christ is the only person who ever did that perfectly. And to Thomas Aquinas, Thomas could claim that all true knowledge is produced by an assimilation of the knower to the thing known. So that assimilation is said to be the cause of knowledge. Now, because these guys did not believe that God is one being among others of greater power and proportion, they believed that to know God properly was simply to be in the right posture. It was to allow oneself to be conformed to God through the image of Christ. And when we are conformed to God in Christ, then our vision is changed. We see as God sees, like Lewis says, I believe in Christianity as I believe that the sun is risen, not only because I see it, but because by it I see everything else. And so it's to see as God sees, it's to will as God wills. In the Lord's Prayer, the central petition is, thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. And it is ultimately to love as God loves. And so when St. John in the first epistle to John says, if you do not love, you do not know God, this is what he's saying. You don't know God if in fact you've not been conformed to God in Christ and share his perspective. In the Gospel of John, we're told that this is what it means to be brought into the Father's heart, which is what Jesus Christ does to us. For the Greeks, the heart, the cardia, is the center, especially of the will and of the intellect. It's not just an emotive organ. All right. So Thomas Aquinas again says, all true knowledge, and especially knowledge of God, can only be said to be produced by an assimilation of the knower to the thing that is known, so that assimilation is said to be the cause of knowledge. And so in the classical perspective, all of the disciplines, whether mathematics, art, literature, philosophy, the sciences, have their place in the right ordering of humans in relation to God and all that God has made. And this, of course, is what the classical approach to education today is meant to sort of do for young people. So why did Lewis get so worked up about Orbelius, who chose to debunk a silly bit of writing on horses where these animals are praised as the willing servants of the early colonists in Australia? You know that Lewis sort of went onto all kinds of tangents. Well, there was always a kind of logic to those tangents. Why did Lewis mount a defense of the weeping horses of Achilles and the war horse of the book of Job, nay, even of Briar Rabbit and of Peter Rabbit? Well, because he believes that there is a fundamental difference between, and this is on page 11, a man who really knows horses and really loves them, not with anthropomorphic illusions, but with ordinate love, and the irredeemable urban blockhead to whom a horse is merely an old-fashioned means of transport. Sorry for the misspellings. So what Lewis is saying is that what great literature will do is it'll train our affections to be properly ordered to each other, to the natural world, to God. And so you can think of great literature, like think of I'm a man, you guys, I don't have to tell you that, but I'm married to Suzanne, who's on this call, and Suzanne twists my arm to get me to watch Jane Austen movies. Okay, she read all the books. I just watch the movies because I read other books. And I usually go into this process complaining, and then I always end up loving it. I can watch those movies over and over again, and I think the reason I can is because Jane Austen is a genius at getting us to love the things that are lovable. Integrity, loyalty, courage, and nobility, chivalry, all these things, and she paints a contrast so wonderfully between those characters whose lives are characterized by vice and those who are truly virtuous. So much so that we get drawn into the story and we love what is to be loved better because of Jane Austen. That's what literature should do. That's what all education should do. It should ultimately glorify God and the things of God. So the educational philosophy of Gaius and Titius, which claims to be disinterested in human affections, will produce only the urban blockheads. It cannot produce ordinate love and has no interest in producing ordinate love. All right. So accordingly, Lewis insists that for every one pupil who needs to be guarded from a weak excess of sensibility, there are three, and I already read this, who need to be awakened from the slumber of cold vulgarity. The task, again, of the modern educator is not to cut down jungles, but to irrigate deserts. The right defense against false sentiments is to inculcate just sentiments. And so we have, especially in the West, but really globally now, a great body of works that are considered great texts and which are tried and true and which do, in fact, this. But in our world, for whatever reason, we're not allowed to sort of make judgments about which texts are to be preferred. I've actually been told this by colleagues, but that who are we to choose what list of books is to be considered the greatest? But in fact, we have a wonderful, wonderful bibliography of books which can properly order us and which should be returned to again and again and again. And new books should be added all the time, of course, but we can discern these things. And so how can we inculcate just sentiments when we do not believe in an objective standard by which to judge sentiments? For Lewis, we must acknowledge, as all people have traditionally done, that there is a natural law, or what he calls the Tao. And so the Tao is, in his own words from page 18, the reality beyond all predicates, the abyss that was before the Creator himself. It is nature, it is the way, the road. It is the way in which the universe goes on, the way in which things everlastingly emerge, stilly and tranquilly into space and time. It is also the way which every man should tread in imitation of that cosmic and supercosmic progression, informing all activities to that great exemplar. And of course, he's speaking of Christ there. He goes on, it is the doctrine of objective value, the belief that certain attitudes are really true and others really false to the kind of thing the universe is and the kind of things that we are. Over against this stands the world of the Green Book. In it, the very possibility of a sentiment being reasonable or even unreasonable has been excluded from the outset. On this view, the world of facts, without one trace of truth or falsehood, justice or injustice, confront one another, and no rapprochement is possible. So, he says, for those within the Tao, the task is to train in the pupil those responses which are in themselves appropriate. And so responses to everything in a child's world are precisely the substance and the focus of education, classically understood. Those without, those who don't recognize the Tao, if they are logical, must regard all sentiments as equally non-rational, as mere myths between us and the real objects. And here's the danger. Those who do not acknowledge the Tao must either decide to remove all sentiments as far as possible, although that's impossible, from the pupil's mind, or else to encourage some sentiments for reasons that have nothing to do with their intrinsic justness or ordinancy. And of course, that is what so-called secular education does. It carries with it all kinds of sentiments. They're just not sentiments that have been reflected upon and judged worthy according to some objective a timeless standard. They are just whatever sort of the culture du jour is, whatever's going on today. Those are the sentiments that our children are formed in, and they're done so without being invited to reflect upon the sentiments that they are being formed in. In other words, we cannot help but teach and form sentiments. It, of course, happens. The question is, what sentiments are we teaching and why? And are we sneaking sentiments in without inviting reflection on the justness or the obstinacy of those sentiments? And of course, I believe that is what we're doing. So what is worthy of our love? Without asking this question, we become subject to the basest appetites. This is where I began, for food and pleasure and the will to survive. We are told to be true to ourselves. Just do you. Okay, it's sort of the Oprah mantra. Lewis reminds us that the head rules the belly through the chest. The seat, as Alanus tells us, the magnanimity of emotions organized by trained habit into stable sentiments. And so the ancients considered the head to be that organ of the intellect, the stomach to be that organ of the emotions or sensibilities, and the chest to be the place where virtues reside. Virtues are developed through the habit of having our emotions and sensibilities follow after a well-trained intellect, okay? So we can think about the things we love and reflect upon them of what is worthy. We can train our imaginations, our sort of intellectual imaginations, in order to love rightly. And then in practicing that love rightly, we develop the chest, okay? And so when he talks about men without chests, he's simply talking about men without virtue, because they have never been trained to develop virtue. And so he says, the operation of the Green Book and its kind is to produce what may be called men without chests. And all the time, this is the final paragraph of our chapter, and it's worth reading in total. It's just a classic paragraph. He says, and all the time, such is the tragicomedy of our situation. We continue to clamor for those very qualities we are rendering impossible. When you think about all the people in the streets this summer burning things down and demanding justice, and don't over-politicize what I'm saying, but doing so and very often rejecting all of the sort of standards through which we might actually learn justice and learn how to pursue justice. It's exactly what Lewis was talking about. You can hardly open a periodical without coming across the statement that what our civilization needs is more drive or dynamism or self-sacrifice or creativity. And then he says this, in a sort of ghastly simplicity, we remove the organ and we demand the function. We make men without chests and expect of them virtue and enterprise. We laugh at honor and are shocked to find traitors in our midst. We castrate and bid the geldings be fruitful. And I believe that is all that I have. And I got through it in about an hour. And so what we're going to do at this point is send you guys into breakout rooms. And I'm going to stop sharing for a moment.